woman without a name. The man who lost God's covering. The children of exile. The era of the erased names. The curse and the transfer. The younger brother in the shadow. The final nameless woman. When bloodline calls, there is a question that both history and religion have quietly passed by. Cain had a wife, but who was she? No name, no voice, no introduction, just a passing line in the Bible, as if unworthy of pause. But if you pose, you'll hear something weeping behind the words. Cain, the one who killed his own brother, the first to be stripped of God's covering, walking in darkness, carrying a mark that could never be erased. And though cast out from the presence of God, he did not go alone. Welcome to Prayer Station. There was a woman who walked with him, a woman never called by name, never mentioned in any lineage, never given a promise. Yet from her womb a new generation was born. If you've ever been silenced, if you are a soul once erased from the memory of others, then this story is for you. Because sometimes, history is not written by those whose names are called, but by those who walked in silence, with God witnessing every step. And this is the beginning of such a chapter. The man who lost God's covering. He was the firstborn of the first human, born not in the garden, but outside, where the earth had cracked under the curse of the fall. Cain grew up with the memory of Eden he never walked in, and perhaps that distance carved a void inside him. Farmed, elaborated, he brought an offering like his brother, but the fire from heaven never touched his. There was no rebuke, no encouragement, just silence. And that silence became the first blade. Cain's eyes fell, not out of hatred but of disappointment. No one taught him how to handle rejection from heaven, and instead of falling before God, he lifted his head and killed his brother. Abel's blood hit the ground, the earth trembled, and for the first time, heaven asked man, "Where is your brother?" Cain had no answer, only a fleeing spirit. A sentence was declared. From now on, the ground will reject you, as you rejected your own blood. No longer a farmer, no longer a worshiper, Cain became an exile to humanity itself. But in this story, there's something no doctrine can quite explain. God did not destroy Cain. Instead of fire, he gave a mark of protection, a declaration that defied human ideas of justice. Do not kill this one. He still belongs to me. Cain deserved to be erased, but was allowed to exist, not because he was innocent, but because grace had not fully withdrawn from those who once heard the first voice of God. And when all was lost, Cain began to rebuild, not in his homeland, not with his family, but in a distant land he called Nod, meaning wandering. A city built by one cast out from heaven, a legacy born from the hands of a murderer. But in this story, Cain did not walk alone. No one mentions it, but there was a woman who followed him, a quiet figure, carrying the human seed. Even though no one bothered to name her, the woman without a name, no one knows where she came from. No description, no role, no welcome. Just one fleeting line. Cain had a wife. That's it. No name, no genealogy, no evidence she existed apart from her attachment to the man who lost God's covering. But she did exist, because without her, there would be no lineage, No descendants, no city built, no promise continued. Perhaps she wasn't chosen, just the one who remained. A younger sister no one mentioned, as if her worth began only when she became someone's wife. But she chose to follow Cain. She chose to walk into exile, not because of her own sin, but for the man marked by a strange seal from God. She didn't walk beside an angel. She didn't walk beside a righteous man. She walked beside a murderer, preserved by God. And in that silence, she became the first mother outside Eden. She gave birth to Enoch. And from Enoch, a new bloodline was sown into the earth. No one honored her. No one carved her name in stone. No hymn was sung about her courage. But if you listen to the space between the words, you will hear the footsteps of a woman who walked into the darkness to keep the flame of humanity from dying out. She wasn't chosen like Eve, not born from a rib. She was born from the dust and forgotten in the dust. But perhaps it is the unnamed ones who carry the holiest weight of history. She didn't need a throne. She didn't need a title. Only a love great enough to walk with the forsaken, and a womb sacred enough to birth hope in a wilderness. This woman had no name, but maybe she was the first one heaven remembered. The children of exile. No one spoke their mother's name. No one dared to openly bless their father. And so these children were born into a void, between being cast out and being held by an invisible hand. Enoch, the first name ever written down. Not the firstborn of humanity, but the first child born in exile. He grew up in a city with no ancestors, no worship festivals, no voice from heaven, only a whisper between earth and ashes. We are still alive, even if we are not welcomed. Cain built a city, but it was the unnamed woman who built the first home for the next generation. She didn't do it for fame, but because she believed. If God still allows breath to remain in her womb, then every child born is a flicker of light, however fragile, kept alive in the dark. Those children had no grandparents telling stories of Eden, no tree of life to wander around, no angel with a flaming sword guarding a door to remind them they once belonged to a holy place. They only had a father with sorrowful eyes and a mark on his forehead, and a mother with strong hands, but a heart that never stopped hoping. Perhaps they weren't recorded in the heavenly genealogies, but their blood spilled to form the nations. Their lineage laid the foundation for the first civilizations. And if you ever thought God only moves through the chosen, look again at the child born from pain and raised outside the light of the garden. Because it is the children no one waited for that prove one thing: grace still remains. Even after the mark, the era of the erased names. Not every child born is remembered. There are names that were never written. There are breaths that never had the chance to echo before being buried by history. And there are generations born into life, but vanished from human memory. The generation of Cain, the lineage of the unnamed woman. They lived, they loved, they built, they died, and no one ever spoke of them again. No book recorded their genealogy. No prophet stood to call them home. No verse ever described their faith, their journey, or their redemption. They were the erased generation, not because they didn't exist, but because they didn't fit the story of the chosen ones. But God never erased them from his sight, because if he placed a mark of protection on the first murderer, would he not also quietly walk beside the children forgotten by the world? Perhaps they were not born within the promise, but they were born within the heart of a mother who chose exile out of love. That unnamed woman held her child with arms unmentioned in scripture. But every night, she whispered to her child, "You were not born to carry your father's guilt. You were born to live. She didn't know if God was watching. She didn't hear a voice, but she still taught her child to pray in silence. She still laid her hand on her child's forehead as if to bless, and in that silence, she taught her child how to be human, even when rejected. That erased generation may have left no legacy of fame, but they left footprints. Footprints not recorded in history books, but written in pain, in faithfulness, and in undying hope. They had no names, but they were the ground upon which the world could stand. Because perhaps God does not wait for us to be famous. He just waits for us to be faithful, even when no one is watching. The curse and the transfer. There are curses that don't need to be spoken aloud. They exist quietly, like a shadow clinging to the soul. And from the day Cain left the garden, that curse was not only on his forehead, it was in the blood, in the distant look in his eyes when he first saw his son, in the long silence between husband and wife, when neither dared to ask, "Is our child?" The result of punishment? Cain didn't answer. The unnamed woman didn't ask, but they both knew. The curse wasn't on the outside, it was within. Not the mark on the skin, but the feeling of no longer belonging anywhere. And in that darkness, something strange happened. Cain's children, those who grew up without a place of worship, without prophecy, without any covenant calling their names, began to build the world. They did not live as exiles. They lived as pioneers. Cain forged metal. Jabal pitched tents, beginning nomadic civilization. Jubal created music. The rejected lineage became the forerunners of civilization, not because they escaped the curse, but because God could use the curse itself to open a transfer. No one believed life would bloom where Cain had touched, but there, the first seeds of creation were planted, and the unnamed woman was not the mother of the patriarchs of faith, but she was the mother of the first ones who knew how to create new things from loss. She taught her sons not to bow their heads. She taught her daughters to use their hands to build shelter for the lost. And somehow, in silence and courage, she passed down something stronger than bloodline. Not power, not title, but the bravery to live. Even when deemed unworthy of life, the curse could not be broken, but it could be transferred. And sometimes, that transfer is a miracle, wrapped in pain. The younger brother in the shadow. No one called Seth's name when the first tragedy happened. He did not witness the blood spilled on the ground, did not hear Abel's scream, did not see Cain's trembling hands after the first sin. He was born after it all, after Eden had closed its gates forever, after the voice of God became rare, after Adam's faith had shattered in his own eyes. Seth entered a world where darkness had replaced purity, where his parents were no longer the same, and his only brother was a wanderer bearing a cursed mark. But because of that, he was born without the burden of the sinner and without the glory of the chosen one. He was simply the remaining brother, and that made Seth different. He did not try to build a city, did not forge, did not raise his voice in song. He did not rise like Cain, nor was he mourned like Abel, but quietly, he held on to what both his brothers had lost. He rekindled something thought to be extinguished, a flame, small, unnoticed, yet sacred. It was the longing to return, not to Eden, but to the first covenant, to the intimacy lost between humanity and God. In the darkness of the first human generation, when every voice carried fear, Seth, unnoticed, powerless, rarely remembered, began to call upon the name of the Lord again. And from the line of this overlooked younger brother would come a bloodline not carrying a curse, but carrying a promise. Because sometimes, God doesn't choose the strongest. doesn't choose the most gifted, but chooses the one who still longs to be near him. In a world growing cold, the final nameless woman. No one recorded her name. No one told of her voice, her figure, or how she prayed in the dark. Even the Bible remains silent. Only a single line appears, not calling her by name, but by her role. And Seth begot Enosh. But before Enosh, there must have been a woman, a nameless woman, quietly carrying a child in a time void of divine presence. No angels appeared, no voice of God in the night, only the weariness of a world that once knew Eden, then was cast out. She was not like Eve, who spoke with the Creator, nor like Cain's first woman, who bore children that built civilizations. She was just the one who remained. Yet in that simple just, she became the final bridge between a broken covenant and the hope of calling upon the name of the Lord again. For from the child she bore, Enosh, a strange sentence emerges, and then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. It was she, the unnamed one, who planted the seed of sacred restoration within her womb. And when she birthed Enosh, she didn't just birth a child. She birthed a generation that would learn to look upward again, not to gaze back at Eden, where they could never return, but to look toward heaven, where prayer could pass through flaming swords and curses, where man, though imperfect, could still be heard, still be loved, and still be remembered. There are women who do not need to be known, because it is their silence that causes heaven to listen again. When bloodline calls, some questions are repeated from generation to generation. Who was Cain's wife? How many daughters did Adam and Eve have? Why were they never mentioned by name? But maybe God is not silent because he doesn't know. He is silent because he wants us to listen with something else. Not the mind, but the soul. For in the gaps between the lines of Scripture, there are whispers not meant for the hurried reader. There are roles assigned to nameless characters, because they do not need the spotlight, but the stillness of faith. Cain did not just carry sin. He carried the first fracture in the human soul, where love was betrayed by jealousy, and life buried beneath a brother's grave. But in the darkness he created, there were still women, unnamed, unheard, unarmed, quietly bearing children, raising them, and preserving the memory of a God who once walked in the garden. Seth was not a radiant light. He was merely a final spark in a shattered family. But from that single spark, a lineage was rewritten. Not the strongest bloodline, nor the most righteous, but the bloodline that remembered how to call upon a name once heard among the trees of Eden. And from those forgotten ones, God quietly chose the bloodline for the one to come. A bloodline not proud of achievements, but broken, humble, and trembling before the sacred presence. Today, we still keep asking, where did Cain find his wife? Who was that woman? Can we trust their existence if Scripture doesn't name them? But maybe the right question is not who, but why. Why did God let them remain hidden? Perhaps because he is inviting you to be the one who writes the missing chapter, not with words, but with your life. Because true bloodline is not found in genes, but in the one who still dares to call his name. In a world that has forgotten, can you hear that call? From Cain, from the nameless woman, from the child born in silence, from the very blood flowing through you. If something deeper, something sacred stirs in you, click subscribe to continue walking with the forgotten revelations of Scripture, and share this video with those who are also longing to find their spiritual roots again.